sure a lot of you guys know who Scott is, but for those of you that don't, Scott Terrio is a debt consultant at Hoy's Mikolos. He's a regular TV celebrity on BNN. He's probably been on there a lot more than I have. So you're kind of the go-to guy on.
That's my day job.
Yeah, exactly. On debt consolidation, and I think you guys are one of the largest debt consolidation firms in Canada. Is that correct?
Yeah, I can give you a bit of a brief on the firm. So we're Hoy's Michaelis and Associates. We're just in Ontario. We're the largest consumer insolvency trustee firm in Ontario, because we only do consumers. We don't do any business. So that our entire focus is individuals. And we've got 25 offices across Ontario.
Wow.
About 100 people in total. I work at the King and Young office when I'm not in my home. So that's my virtual office. I actually drove down there yesterday. It took me 11 minutes from High Park to get to downtown Toronto. That's amazing.
How long is that normally for you?
Well, at least 30 minutes, but with traffic, with rush hour traffic, it'd be well over an hour. So it's just phenomenal. It's like a ghost town. It's so weird, but
yeah, I know. It's super, super strange.
Last year, our firm did just under 6,000 filings for the year. That's a pretty good range to get a handle on what's going on. So this year,
so what was that number again? 6,000?
About 5,800 files last year. Yeah. And this year we were expecting that to be up substantially. And everything was going like ramping right up until this hit. So there's a seasonality to this stuff. And usually February, March, April, May are huge months every year because people are getting over the Christmas spending and they're kind of looking at their books and financially devastated. So we were in mid-stride when this hit. So you got
a few banked anyways.
Oh yeah, but it's all changed now. It's totally different now than it was before this started. So
yeah, so let's dive into that, because I just want to provide like a little bit of context here for people, because this is like something that I've talked to you about. Last time I was in Toronto there at that Veritas conference. I know that you're always a popular guy at those events. But I think I want to bring a little. Yeah. Yeah, a little bit of context background here is that this is something that I've kind of, been beating home. It's something that I'm quite passionate about, because I think from like a larger term macro overview picture is coming into this, Canadian households are one of the most indebted. They're the most indebted in the G7, I think second most to Australia in the G20. So household debt to GDP is 101% of GDP. Our debt servicing ratio actually hit all-time highs in 2019, despite record low interest rates. So, I mean, that's pretty telling that coming into this pre-virus, that Canadian households are extremely stretched despite interest rates basically being at close to all-time lows. And we also had near record low savings rates dating back to about 1960. So basically there wasn't a whole lot of rainy day fund. But the reality is people have been cautioning about the whole debt picture in Canada for at least 10 years. And it's kind of just basically over the last couple of years, it's kind of fallen on deaf ears, because it's like, yeah, it doesn't matter, like whatever. And I think it doesn't matter until it eventually matters. And it seems like now, obviously, you've kind of had this exogenous shock that nobody saw coming. But as we can probably both agree, there's always the shock coming. It's just a matter of, what it is and when it's coming. So with that kind of in mind, I mean, where are we at today with consumer insolvencies? You kind of gave us a little bit of context to begin with. But you guys were off to a hot pace this year. But what were the numbers looking like coming into this? Because I know, consumer insolvencies were obviously up.
Yeah.
I think, over the last number of years. So
yeah, so that's right. So we're back into a new wave of insolvency filings as of about the last 12 or 13 months is when it started ramping back up again. We had hired a number of people in order to prepare for that, because it's going to be a long run. Last year, filings were up 15+% or something like that, depending where you're looking, regionality. And this year, I think Doug guessed another 10. I guessed another 20, just because I think there's much more of a backlog of people who, got through another Christmas, one last hurrah, and can't make it go anymore. And that was before all of this. So this is all like the consumer debt picture that you painted there was before all of this. And I kept saying that, any kind of a normal organic challenge to the financial system or to the economy would be really damaging on already precarious households. And now you get this. And, this is like dumping kerosene on a campfire. And what's changed is, so people were calling us and they were, 93% of our filings were renters, right? So 7% were homeowners up until this. So we keep call it the homeowners index, bankruptcy index. And that's just the percentage I just told you. So it's now sitting at all-time lows right now since we've been doing it for about 11 years. And we figured at some point in the next 2 years, that would go back up to around high 20s as more homeowners got to the point where they couldn't manage their debts anymore. So, and the reason for that is homeowners have got a lot more runway when it comes to options for dealing with their debts, right? And whereas renters, they don't have home equity to fall back on. Their credit profiles oftentimes worse, and so it just takes the homeowners a longer time to get into the insolvency zone, sort of thing. So we were expecting that in the next 12 to 24 months, and I think this COVID thing is going to move that up. It's just going to accelerate everything for the homeowners, because now what we're getting, instead of getting 7% of people calling us who own homes, now it's probably 30 or something like that. Because if you
is that just in the last couple months?
No, the last couple of weeks. Because if you think about it, how many people have lost their jobs suddenly, right? And that doesn't care whether you're a homeowner or a renter. Doesn't matter, right? If you lose your job unexpectedly, and tons of people do all of a sudden, you're going to have a hell of a lot more people than 7% who are homeowners, because most Canadians are, I think it's 2/3 homeowners, 1/3 renters or something. So you got to think that that's normal, right? So now we're having homeowners phone us because instead of, oh shit, I can't make a rent payment, I can't make a mortgage payment, right? So I think that this event is going to pull forward the homeowners being in more trouble than they would otherwise have been.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting things. That it's like, if you think about it, like realistically, is like if you're going into bankruptcy as a homeowner in this environment, like pre-virus, like you're doing something very wrong.
Yeah.
Because it's almost impossible. Like if you bought a house, like it's basically been like you can't lose on it in the last 10 years.
Yeah.
Even the last like basically 20 years. And we had a 6-month dip in 2008.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it's like, it's basically, so I know I have to laugh because like everybody, in the industry is always like, well, yeah, like Canadians are very, good about their debt, and look how low the foreclosure rates are.
Yeah.
It's like, well, how do you logically foreclose? If you get yourself into trouble, the housing market just keeps going up. So you either just refinance
or sell
for a profit.
Yeah.
So is that basically like that's been your experience essentially?
Yeah.
Correct?
Well, and I mean, the other thing that is kind of useless is delinquency rates, because I have people come into our office to file bankruptcy and they've never missed a mortgage payment, right? So, it's like Canadians don't not pay their mortgage, right? That's the last thing that they stop paying. They stop paying their credit cards, their utilities, their car loan, all of that before their mortgage, right? So that's last ditch stuff. And so that's why those numbers don't really tell you a whole lot. But I think this kind of crisis, I should say this kind of crisis, like we have them often, this catastrophe, this financial catastrophe is something that is affecting everybody, right? So now you have the field is much more leveled in terms of the profile of the person who's in trouble, because job loss is always the biggest, is the worst thing, right? See, we see people driven in by events, right? Like, so divorce, or somebody in the family gets sick, or one spouse loses their job but not the other. Well, this one is like both spouses losing their job, right? And people who had really good credit and were good solid homeowners and whatever, well, you lose your job, right? So it's the longer this thing goes in shutdown, the much worse it's going to be for all these people. So it's a
Yeah,
matter of if it's a couple of months or if it's like 5 or 6, that's going to be a huge difference to the economy, I think.
yeah, I think that's one of the things that I've been hearing, like anecdotally talking to mortgage brokers and saying like, hey, what are you experiencing? What's your, and they're, I'm hearing stories of very well paid professionals,
Yep.
and even some business owners, dentists, medical professionals where their practice has been closed or shut down
Yeah.
temporarily,
Yeah.
just because they have these crushing rents where,
Yeah.
or pilots, for example, these are generally high income earners that are temporarily laid off, and people just don't have the rainy day fund.
Yeah, you're right about that. And that's why like last year I filed something like 15 lawyers. I did
Wow.
a bunch of doctors, dentists, chiropractors, pilots, I mean, I work in Bay Street areas, so it's, I get lots and lots of guys in the financial community that file. It doesn't really matter. Like if you run into a problem and you're making 200,000 versus if you're making 60,000, you're both in trouble, right? It's just because your expense profile, if you're making 200, is 2-3 times as much, right? So you got to cover 10,000 a month versus the other guy that's got to cover 3. Well, neither of you has any income now. So, oftentimes the ones that were used to making the bigger bucks, if you don't save, then you're still living paycheck to paycheck. You're just spending more every month. And so all of them have a cash flow issue, right? As soon as something happens, there's an immediate cash flow issue. And I'm not sure that if this doesn't change people's saving habits, then nothing will. And I don't know if it will, to be honest.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was reading, I'd followed this, but I was reading a piece recently from Veritas Research, and I think they were saying that since the 2008 financial crisis, just to give you an example, is that U.S. households, which went through that sort of painful deleveraging,
Yep.
Household debt servicing ratio, I think, is at all-time lows coming into this virus, and Canada's obviously at all-time highs. But the U.S. household saving rate, I think, since the financial crisis has averaged about 7%.
Yeah.
And I think Canadian households savings rates averaged about 3.5.
Yeah.
So it kind of just goes to show you what happens when people sort of get wiped out.
Yeah.
Their habits tend to change a little bit. I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen here, but I suspect that this has to change psychologically, at least to some aspect.
And I think I used to spend a lot of time in the States when I worked for John Deere for 14 years. And I was down there 15 to 20 weeks a year usually. And, so you see a lot. And I think as a general rule of thumb, I think Americans, even though people would probably think Canadians were better savers and more sound financially, that was kind of the picture we were painted with in the 08-09 crisis, the solid banking system. Americans are more individualistic, I think, than Canadians. So I think that might be why they kicked their savings into gear after that, because they're a little more protective anyways, like, not as forthcoming with financial information, a little more, suspect about industries and systems and big government, stuff like that. And so that doesn't surprise me a lot from my experience in America. I think up here, we're much more naturally inclined to trust to higher authorities and, the old solid oligarchy of British, banks, right? The big five chartered banks. And so, I just think that's a lot more a Canadian mentality, and I don't think it'll help us in saving. This might do it, depending on, this is a big shock to the system here, right? And so I think it's going to depend on how much people crave social, kind of re-engaging in being out later, because everybody's trapped at home, and as soon as they throw the switches, they're going to be out again, and maybe it'll just be like the Roaring '20s, right? Miniature version of the Roaring '20s. Everybody parties for a few years or something. I'm not sure, but
yeah,
I just think a lot of people are going to.
Yeah, one of the things
a lot of people were not well
ahead.
set up before this happened, right? And so it's one thing to get whacked when you're in decent shape. It's another thing to get whacked when you're in terrible shape. So.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I always kind of think about a lot is like feedback loops. So it's like if you have this kind of virus, ravage Canadian households, and obviously, I've heard of friends personally that were like, yeah, I'm gonna have to dip into my RSP here.
Yep.
So they're dipping into their savings. I have to think that once this passes and people go back to work, like I think that's going to be in the process of kind of repairing their balance sheet, repairing some of their savings. And like when you have a Canadian economy that is dependent, 65% of GDP is through consumer spending roughly. That
Mhm.
like even just for consumers to pull back on their spending just means that you're going to have a sluggish recovery. Like
Yeah,
you're going to have
I
to
think.
try to, you know,
Yeah, interesting point about the natural of the feedback loop, right? Because yeah, if people do purge their potential retirement funds now, well, now you've got a whole, kind of a whole generation of people that just set themselves back significantly to keep out of trouble. And what are they going to have to work in another 10 years? Then people be working in their 80s, right? So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the 6 to 12 months once we are all sort of back to work, right? Because it's people will be out, they'll be trying to feel normal again. Part of feeling normal is spending if you've got it, right? Like having, like being able to do things. If you've had kids at home for 3 to 6 months, cooped up, you're going to want to do stuff with them, I imagine, right? So it's, a lot of this is very natural, is human psychology, right? It's, so that's going to be, there's going to be as much good social sociology work on this, I think, as anything afterwards.
yeah, no doubt. I also had a couple questions on, so I think people like just to sort of distinguish, we knew that consumer insolvencies were rising.
Mhm.
But can you like, how do you factor that into, like, I hear sometimes a rebuttal, well, the population's growing, immigration's, got to play a factor in some of those numbers. Do you have any sort of comment on how that factors into the numbers, into the rise pre-virus and into the consumer insolvencies?
Uh, well, we actually see in Toronto, in the bigger centers, we see a very high percentage of people who have only been in this country for a few years, um, because you arrive here and you're not super financially sound right away, right? You're learning, all the cultural mores and the rules of the, how things work. You probably don't speak the language necessarily, and there's a lot of barriers to you doing well, right? And even though it's a good country to come to, right? But you're not hitting the ground running, and the problem is there's a lot of predatory lending that really gets into those communities, and gets them, into a rut, where they're behind the eight ball, from the get go almost, because like they need money. And like, even if you're working, try living in Toronto, just coming off a plane from somewhere other side of the world and making a go of it. So luckily, most of them have families, uh, when they get here, but a lot of them have to resort to credit, and credit is way too readily available in this country. And the banks even have separate programs for getting new immigrants into credit cards and lines of credit where otherwise you wouldn't have been able to, because they want you in their barn, right? Not the other guy's barn. So once you're in there, your family's probably in there and you're going to stay in there for a long time. That's kind of the typical credit profile in Canada, right? So we see a lot of that where, the person has only been here for 1 to 5 years and they've got run up $60,000-$70,000 in credit, right? Because it's tough to make ends meet, and tougher than they expected when they came, right?
What can you run me through like a typical case? Like, do you have any like examples of, I mean, maybe interesting examples, clients? I mean, you obviously know you can't discuss,
Yeah,
the specifics of it, but just sort of as a general, like typically what you'll see and
yeah, yeah. So normally what we see is, someone comes in, they are either most often a renter, working a pretty decent job, you know, making a few thousand after tax a month kind of thing, not super rich or anything. But their costs, their costs per month of things that are hard to change have gone up substantially, right? So shelter, number one, because a rising housing market raises everything, right? Rents as well. And so Toronto has become very, competitive for getting an apartment, as Vancouver is. And so they'll come in and they'll say, okay, well, look, I've accumulated debt over the last 5 or 10 years. We're seeing a lot more student debt, but it's a gradual thing. This is not something where people run out and borrow irresponsibly and then run into our office and go, well, look, I ran up 50 grand in the last 6 months. I got to go bankrupt. Like, nobody ever does that. So we always see people who have a couple of sets of debt. So they have their older chunk, maybe 30,000 of it is, from years ago, right? Like just accumulated over time. And they've run into a couple of situations along the way where, I don't know, mom got sick and she lives on the other side of Canada. I had to go help her out because my brothers are deadbeats or whatever. So then they've got newer debts. So they've got another set of debts where it's a secondary lender group, like not the big five banks, but not the payday lenders either. The ones that kind of fall in the middle, right? So that's less. So there's 30 plus another maybe 10 or 15. And then maybe they've, last ditch gone to a payday lender, and that's usually the last straw. Because once you're in there, you're kind of doomed. So that's typically what we see. About 50 our renters have about 45 to 50,000 in consumer debt, and our homeowners have about 70. Which I know
50,000, yeah, 50,000 debts. Why does it? I'm curious as to why it takes so long for these people to finally come in. Like you're saying, some of these guys have debt for the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
That just
it gets habitual, right? So paying minimum payments becomes a monthly bill, for people. Like they just keep doing it, right? And human nature is to just keep pushing things down the road, and a lot of them ignore it for a long time, and they just kind of get into a rut. It's a hard thing to get into our office, right? Like I think it takes a lot of, by the time people come into our office, there's not much convincing to do, right? They've already done they've lost their sleep, they've soul searched, they've talked to family, friends, accountants, whatever. So they've gone through all of that process already, and people just kind of go along. Like normally, almost every client that I've ever had, which is about 6,000 now, personally, has said I should have come in 12 to 24 months before, always. Because that's the problem, is they get into a financial problem and they don't come in for another 12 months or more. So it's not like they hit a rut and come in. Whereas now with this thing, they are coming in right away, because you don't expect to lose your job the next morning, right? Like people are losing their jobs where there was no chance they were going to lose their job. And so all of a sudden, that mental profile has changed to more immediate. It's not going to take them 2 years to figure out that they need help, right? Because a lot of these people who've lost their jobs temporarily aren't going to get them back, right? I don't think like a lot of people that call me said, well, I'm probably going to be back at work in 3 months. Well, you know what? I think there's going to be a lot of cases where that's not the case, because maybe the company wasn't in as good a shape as they thought, because they're just a worker bee, and how would they know, right? Or maybe, like you said, you get feedback loops where the supply chain was decimated so that the business was fine, but all the suppliers are gone, right? And nobody thought of that, maybe, or nobody realized how difficult that was going to be. So that's the typical profile we kind of see, and then we just usually do a proposal for the debts, right? So I think we're up to 75 or 80% of our files are proposals now. So.
Yeah, I want to touch on the proposals. I think one of the things that interests me is that just how much of like a lagging indicator it is for like your insolvencies to start rising.
Yep.
But the fact that they're like rising, basically close to decade highs, essentially, coming into this, right? So they're rising at a time when the unemployment rate was basically at all-time lows, or I think since 50, 60-year lows. And wage growth was rampant, because towards the end of the business cycle, you get rampant wage inflation as people request higher wages, and because labor is tight. That is what concerns me, is the fact that we were already seeing stresses at a time when really, up until 2 months ago, the economy was fairly tight. So it kind of makes me think that when we start to see these things compound, you might not see the impacts of this virus. Like it could take several years for these cases to sort of come through and ultimately peak. It could take a couple of years for these to peak
I
out.
think that's interesting too, right? Because you're right. There's always a lag time. So, when a number of people get into trouble organically, which we saw last year before, just from, over time, it takes a year or two before that plays itself out in the insolvency system. And now what's going to happen is you're actually going to, so the February insolvency stats just came out yesterday, and they were up again, of course, right? So, and you're going to see that until March, April, May, and then they're going to be toast. Because right now, when someone calls us right now, we're still filing people who are working. That's normal. But the people who are calling us who have just lost their jobs with this COVID thing, and I don't know what to call it now, so that's what I call it, the COVID thing. But, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. So if the people that are calling us now that have just lost jobs and are suddenly in it up to their necks, they're not filing yet, because you don't want to file a bankruptcy or a proposal necessarily when there's uncertainty, because you can't stop it. Like, it's a legal procedure, right? So, proposal's 5 years. That's a big commitment. Do you want to be doing that before, like these guys who say, well, I'm going back to work in 3 months. Well, what if they don't, right? What if you file a proposal right now, which sounds perfectly sensible, and you're getting your curb benefit of $2,000 a month, and then you end up, your job's gone, or the business you worked at is gone. So now you're still in your proposal, and you're probably bound to fail it at some point because you've got none of your steady income from before, right? So what we're telling the majority of people right now is just hold on, right? I know you're worried, but essentially everybody's creditor proof now, right? Unless you owe tax.
How does that work? Can you run us through?
Yeah. So if, let's say you have $30,000 worth of credit card debt, or 20, whatever, and right now you just lost your job and now you're on curb. Well, you're creditor proof because you're only getting government income, and judgment creditors like banks can't come after government income, and the courts are closed anyway. So right now, everybody is effectively creditor proof because you can't even enforce something through the courts because they're closed. So, we can still file in the courts because it's a summary administration. It's not a complicated, it's done through the courts, but we don't go to court. So we're still filing proposals and bankruptcies. But if you are a bank right now and you try to sue somebody who missed 2 or 3 payments, you can't sue them anyway because you don't have a court order to enforce the lawsuit, right? And there's no wages to garnish anyway. So effectively, Canada is creditor proof right now, unless you owe CRA debt, tax debt, and then they might withhold your EI or your curb benefit, but they're not supposed to, but I've seen it happen. So
you're telling people, let's say I have $30,000 in credit card debt.
Yeah.
And, I just lost my job. So I call you and say, hey, I'm kind of screwed here. I'm hoping I'll go back to work in 2 months, my same, cushy job, but I'm really not sure. So in that aspect, you're just saying, okay, we'll just hold on. And then you're saying what happens in, like, let's say I do get rehired.
Yeah.
I'm still behind the 8 ball. And I just feel like, so then what's the process look like there? So that's one example. And then what does the example look like if I don't get rehired in 2 months, or if I do get rehired, it's with a different company and my salary goes down by, $15,000 annually.
Okay. So for the first scenario where the guy does get rehired in 3 months. So right now we're telling him, don't do anything because nobody can come after you anyway right now. The government's giving you money right now as emergency funds, right? You focus on the roof over your head and the food in your kids' mouths or whatever. And then you try and you wait till you're back to work. Like, none of us knows, if they come up with a vaccine tomorrow, it's still going to be time before everything's sorted, right? So we're essentially putting them on hold. And then once we know something, so let's say now the guy goes back to work, great. So if he wants to do a proposal now, we just do a proposal based on his income with that job because we know it's steady and he can handle a 5-year proposal because you can't miss 3 payments over the 60 months of the proposal, okay? And so now we got nice stability, it's steady, it's predictable. And you can always amend a proposal if you do lose your job later or lose income. But at least now we have a stable platform upon which to do a proposal to the creditors, right? In the other scenario where the guy thinks he's going to get back to work and then he doesn't. So the boss calls everybody and says, restaurants closed, sorry. And nobody wants to hire restaurant workers now because, the industry's been decimated and they can't handle them all. So now what we do is we also say, okay, do you want to do a proposal or bankruptcy? Because now we know, again, we're not waiting to hear about the guy's job. Now we know he doesn't have one, right? So we would structure it for the curb benefit or whatever he's getting. And then if he gets a job later, great, because the creditors can't come back and ask for more in a proposal. So those guys are going to be laughing because they will have been paying way, way less cents on the dollar, because once a proposal is approved by the creditors, they can't ask for more later. So if you do get rehired later, you're just, hey, I'm paying my $200 a month or something, whereas he should have been paying maybe $4 or $5 or whatever. So that's what we're doing in each of those scenarios.
Right. So it sounds like, yeah, it's definitely like a long sort of drawn out process for someone like a homeowner, right? Like they lose their job.
Yeah.
I know how the foreclosure process works here in BC, but maybe you can touch on it just in general, particularly in
Sure.
Ontario. Let's just say, as a hypothetical, two maybe well-off individuals, maybe a little bit stretched, wife loses her job. So now they're down to one income. They're getting behind on their mortgage payments, even though they can defer them. Let's say that this thing resumes and they just can't catch up. So they miss a couple mortgage payments. How does that foreclosure process look like? At what point does RBC Bank start to go through that court-ordered process?
Right. So let's talk about that in general. So there's two types of procedures for this. There's foreclosure and there's power of sale, right? And it's very regional. Some provinces tend to use foreclosure. Some provinces tend to use power of sale. Each can use both, but it's more of a practice. So I know in BC it's foreclosure. In Ontario, it's mostly power of sale. And they do the same thing, right? So if you don't pay your mortgage for long enough, we take your house, we sell it. But in power of sale, it's less of a court-heavy procedure. It's much more efficient. But with the courts being closed, you can't get a sheriff to go out to the house. So right now, even in power of sale proceedings, where there's less court, you can do everything, but you can't get the sheriff. And if you can't get the sheriff, you can't get the house. In foreclosure, it actually is a court-heavy process. So everybody goes to court, and it's complicated. And if you sell the house for a lot more than the mortgage, the lender gets to keep that. Whereas in power of sale, you, the homeowner, get the surplus. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or to you, I guess I'm
So
talking.
how long is that length? How long is the length in Ontario? Because I can say in BC, typically what we see is like the time you miss a payment to the time it goes through all the courts and the lender eventually gets paid out. You're looking between 12 to 15 months.
Yeah, that's possible. I think it's probably shorter in power of sale, much shorter. But right now what's going to happen is the courts are going to be backlogged.
Yeah.
So anybody like in your description who, the one person lost their job and then later on they found it's tough to get back to normal life. They're starting to miss payments, whatever, right? Because that's going to happen a lot where people are going back, resuming their mortgage payments, but now they got half the income, right? So they're going to be screwed unless the other person gets working or something, right? And if the economy is screwed, then you're going to have a hard time getting work again. So you're going to have a whole lot of that happening. And in that case, if they miss, well, I can't tell you how many because it's different for every bank, I think. But if you miss 2 or 3 payments, they're going to send you a letter first, right? Because they have to give you a 10-day statutory period notice before they come and get your house and all that stuff. But the courts are going to be so badly backlogged at this point, right? So when the switch gets thrown again, and again, the more months this thing goes, the worse it's going to be. The courts are going to be massively backlogged. So you're not even going to get in line for a hearing until who knows when, right? So people could be sitting in their houses having missed multiple payments, and the bank can't get the house because the court is so backed up. And that's the difference now than before, right? Whereas before it's pretty cut and dried, like power of sale, you're going to have that house within a couple of months kind of thing. So.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. I was going to ask you about how do you see how prevalent is it to see? And so you're talking about, that's the thing, is what I look at is probably the most vulnerable position of the housing market would be, in my opinion, is kind of the private lending space.
Yeah.
So the private lending mortgage mix originations, they make up, and Bank of Canada estimates in Vancouver and Toronto, it's roughly about 10% of new mortgage originations over the last few years.
Mhm.
So that's a huge chunk of the market that obviously doesn't have the credit worthiness to actually get approved at the big banks.
Yeah.
And so now we're entering a situation where, like, let's say you're in second, RBC might defer your mortgage payment for 6 months, but these private lenders, these MICs, most likely obviously are not going to. And even if they want to now start the foreclosure process, is the courts are closed.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a mess.
And not only that, but those private guys are not sophisticated in this stuff, right? I mean, the banks have lawyers on retainer to do this. They just send them an email and say, start it, right? Mm-hmm. Call these 200 people or whatever. Well, the private guys, they don't have that kind of sophistication. I'm sure they have a lawyer, but they're not going to be as in tune with that procedure as everybody else anyway, right? And the other thing is, you might have your first mortgage with a big bank and you're up to date on that payment, but your second mortgage is with the private guy and you're behind. Well, guess what happens? The private guy can still sell your house.
Yeah.
He can initiate proceedings and the bank just goes, okay, we're getting paid first. So I guess that one's gone. Right. But I've already had 2 people call me for that situation where their second and third were both privates. I know, man, it's very ugly. And so the big 5 bank, that's their first mortgage, they're happy, right? They're getting paid every month. And okay, well, you sell the house, we get paid in full, we're made whole. And then number 2 and number 3 are pretty much burnt, right? So, a lot of these times when they're second and third, there's not much point in them selling the house anyway, because it's probably underwater in that case, or close to no equity. And they're not going to get paid probably anyways, right? The first bank will. But sometimes where there's equity, they sure as hell will try and go for it, right? Because they might get, even 50% of what they're owed, right?
Yeah, I think that this is kind of one of the things. It's just kind of like feedback loops again, right? We talk about it's just like they have this feedback loop.
We're going to realize how interconnected all of this is in the next 6 to 12 months. Big time.
Yeah, exactly. Your house goes up, so you spend a little bit more money because you're feeling you have that wealth effect. Then you tap into that home equity line of credit. You lend it to these private lenders. You tap your HELOC at 3.5%. You lend it to a MIC at 8%.
Yeah.
You take that spread. Then these guys go and lever that money out to more people, and that just pushes the prices higher. It's like the more of credit availability you have, the more prices rise. And it seems like, again, I think this, my only concern is just the feedback loops.
Yes.
That propelled prices higher could easily flip in the reverse.
Yep.
To me, that's the largest, when people ask me like, well, what's going to happen in this housing market? To me, that is like the most vulnerable situation. It's just like these feedback loops. And then like the fact of the matter is, like, I think these feedback loops can take minimum 6 to 12 months to start to actually come into play.
Yep.
Whereas
we don't know what people's minds are going to be like after this, right? Like, this is a pretty seismic event, right? And so, this might change a lot of people, right? And so, if people slowly get back to work, like I saw a thing this morning, it was a poll where it said, when everybody's back, when all the restrictions are lifted, how many weeks will it take you to go back to your first restaurant? And it was interesting to see, like 25% said right away. And then there was nothing for the next 2 categories. And then the 6 or 7 weeks plus was like 80%. Because I think this has made a lot of people germ freaks, like it going out is weird, right? Because it's apocalyptic, right? There's nobody around. Everybody's staying away from each other, And so I think this is going to change a lot of people's behaviors. And I don't think there's any way to know what that will be. And that will prolong the recovery because it's, again, uncertainty, right? So uncertainty, markets don't like uncertainty. So, I don't think real estate is going to come out too badly in all this, frankly, in the big cities, but I think maybe other places. The only thing that could happen, and I had this kind of conversation with somebody yesterday, is this whole work from home thing, right? Like, companies are realizing now that they can function, maybe not great, and every industry is different, right? Some industries might be really hurt by this, like they can't just get it done. But a lot of industries are finding now, like ours, well, do we need to go back to an office? Maybe not. And so if that really takes hold at some point, Like, in other words, if there's another strain of this stuff, so let's say we get this sorted out and then there's another strain next year, and this becomes like a, we're doing this again thing in the next year or two. I think a lot of people are going to go, you know what? I don't need to live in a city with all the expense of living in a city. Like, what's the difference, right? Why not get a massive house for 300 grand with a big yard on a river somewhere, right? All I need is good Wi-Fi. So I wonder how that's going to affect people too, because if we don't all go down to Bay and King every day like lemmings, then maybe this changes things, because if that, in that case, the commercial landlords are going to get slaughtered.
Yeah, I think I think that's what's possible is, like, from a bigger picture secular theme.
Yep.
Is seeing more and more people working from home. And then, I mean, you could argue that eventually you're going to get, maybe autonomous vehicles at some point down the road, and that just creates more sprawl sort of thing. So I think that I wouldn't rule that out.
Yeah,
that's definitely a bigger picture for sure.
Yeah.
I just wanted to rip through some of these Q&As from some other people here.
Yeah, there's some interesting ones over here.
I know I'm getting bombarded here, so I'm just trying to see here. Let me read these out. When COVID is over and the jobless find jobs again, will the stress on debt be abated? Or say, is current situation temporary challenge to the housing market? My personal thoughts are, I think this is going to take at least 6 to 12 months to sort of start playing out. What do you have? What's your view, Scott, on consumer insolvencies? Obviously, you think over the next 2 to 3 months, because of the shutdown, are basically going to be almost not quite non-existent, but very, very low.
Yeah.
And then at that point, it just becomes, you think you're just going to skyrocket to new highs, or what do you think?
Yeah, what we're prepping for is that 2 or 3 months is going to be, like everybody, there's going to be still people filing. But if an office was doing 40 files a month, now they're going to be doing 15 or 20 kind of thing, right? And then we're going to be doing 50 or 60 later. So, because as soon as you have the stability again, either you're not working or you're working. Doesn't matter either way. As soon as you know something, then we're going to go nuts. So as soon as they, whoever they are, say it's all good to go back and return to normal, even if it's paced out, that's when it's going to start to open up like crazy, I think, because it's not going to get any better. If you have debt already and you've lost a job in your household, it's not going to get any better. So when I disagree about the cottages comment.
Yeah, I think people will keep asking me. One of my things was, I actually think that having a high unemployment rate, like people losing their jobs, I think is personally more damaging than like a spike in interest rates.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is the worst. The worst case scenario is just job loss, and even any economist will tell you that. And I think cottages, I think the opposite. It's going to be a rich man's game. So maybe somebody sells their cottage, but at some point they're not building any more lakes or mountains. So there's only so many cottages, and the more, like, I've seen it up at our place, like, we're not in Muskoka, right? We're over in Halliburton, Kawarthas, which is further east. But there's been massive price appreciation in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think when all this shakes out, the people that sold their places, I mean, they're all obviously going to regret it, because you're never getting back in, I think, but it'll be a rich man's game. And I think the cottages will just be massive premium, because that's a playland, right? Like, you don't need that.
Yeah.
Right? If you can afford a cottage, then who cares if it's 1.2 or 1.6 million? Don't give a shit. Right?
Oh yeah, 100%. I actually think, if you want to talk about bigger picture stuff, like, I definitely think there's a deflationary shock, and the real estate market's going to be impacted here over the next probably 12 to 24 months. Mm-hmm. But I also have a view that, given the insane amount of monetary policy, quantitative easing, just these policies are absolutely, they're probably necessary to some extent, but some of them are just absolutely ridiculous, that you're going to want to have hard assets like real estate. because I think the currency is just going to get completely debauched.
Yeah, I think I agree with that too.
But that's not going to prevent a wave of delinquencies, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, the whole deferral thing is going to be interesting too, because I'm finding people running into challenges on those. The CIBC had 20,000 requests in one day last week. I think it was Thursday. 20,000 in one day. Like, they're not set up for that. Okay. And they're scrambling, and they're getting set up by redeploying people. But man, that's a lot. And again, I think that's what prolongs the recovery is, you end up with all of these deferrals, and they're deferrals, right? They're not forgiveness. You still owe those payments. And the banks are going to tack that interest on at the end, right? So now you've got to pay it eventually. And are you going to be able to, like you said, your example where the one spouse loses their job and not the other? Well, now when the one goes back to work, or maybe, no, sorry, when the one goes physically back to work, and then the other one can't find work because the economy is so screwed up, now all of a sudden their mortgage payment, which was a lot of pressure on them before, is now way more pressure because it's just become a higher percentage of their income going towards the mortgage payment, right? So you're going to have a lot of people not find out that they're in trouble until several months from now, right?
Yeah, no, I think especially too, I even think like some of these mom and pops that like maybe leveraged up into a single family house and they rent out their basement. I'm a little bit worried about what, if you get some, some turnover in the vacancies. And then, I actually think, now Ben talked about this in his interview with Doug there, but I think that, I think there's some downwards pressure potentially in the short term on the rents.
Yeah.
Especially when people get laid off, right? That's just a deflationary.
Yeah. And I've heard some, like in Toronto, and I'm sure this is the same in Vancouver, anybody who has been renting a place for years, right, is still on the old rent. Obviously the amount they're allowed to increase every year, but they're still paying rent from, 7 or 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. And landlords want those people out, right? Because they want to get somebody in and double the rent, right? And so I hear a lot of stories about, the whole rent eviction thing, and now with this happening, the first week that this happened, when we were home answering calls, a lot of people were talking about how their landlord slipped a note under the door on March 30th saying, wow, hey, guess what? You got to pay. I don't care what Doug Ford said, you got to pay. And so there's a lot of shenanigans going on with landlords trying to get people out. There's a lot of good stories too, by the way, of really good landlords. But, that financial pressure is out there where if I can get $2,000 for a place instead of $1,400, I'm going to try, right?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. One of the questions here, and you were on the call with Ron Butler. People were I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but people are asking a lot of questions about, do you think banks are going to tighten credit in the HELOC space?
Geez, I hope I answered the right way then that I did before. So yeah, I think they are. Sure, I think they naturally are. Banks are throwing all kinds of levers now that we haven't seen for a while. And they were starting to do that anyway. Even before this happened, they were starting to cap, lines of credit, unsecured lines of credit. They were starting to up people's interest rates here and there. So I think it is absolutely inevitable, because the banks are now going to be sitting there going, okay, everyone's lost their job and they're all desperate for funds, and they've got a $70,000 HELOC untouched. What do you think they're going to do? Right? And a lot of people are going in and getting as much as they can, putting it in another bank if they're smart. And then guess what? So the banks aren't stupid, right? This is all risk model stuff. So they know that it's one certain stage of whatever financials situation they're in. Here's the 3 things we do, or the 4 things we do. And so I think the people with the worst credit profiles, with the highest HELOC availability, are going to be toast, because they're going to say, sorry, you're done. It's just inevitable, I think.
You see a lot of cases personally, like how frequent is it for people to have HELOCs and come into you and say, hey, I need a consumer proposal, and just tap this HELOC? And
not very frequent at all, because only 7% of our filers are homeowners in the first place, right? And the ones who are coming in to see us are probably tapped already, right? So we don't get a lot of people coming in who have HELOC availability because they probably use the HELOC to not come in to see me, right? So it doesn't happen very much at all, frankly. But the calls we've been getting since this started, because we're getting more homeowners call us, because again, they lost their job and they looked us up, I guess. And so they'll call and they'll say, well, yeah, I still got a whole bunch of room on my HELOC. And so I'll say, well, maybe you maybe use that or refinance the whole thing, right? And just roll the consumer debt in or something like that. Like, we're not telling them to do proposals, because why would you take that step before you tried the other one? But every day that goes by, there's a chance that the bank will tighten things and clamp down, right?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Someone's asking about immigration. How do you see immigration playing a factor in the population growth? People who work here on visas will lose their jobs. I know you were saying at the beginning that you tend to see a lot more recently immigrated people coming in for proposals and bankruptcy.
Yeah, well, they're vulnerable. They're vulnerable on from a credit perspective, right? Because they're new here. One of the elements of your credit score is credit history. And Canada doesn't recognize anybody else's credit history. So if you just moved here from the Philippines last year, guess what? You got no history, and that's like 15% of your score, because there's no international treaties on debt or on credit recognition in terms of credit scores. So yeah, they get here and their credit is pretty crappy, not really of any fault of their own, but just because of the way the system works. And so then, like I said, they get desperate or in a tight spot because their income is probably precarious, or their employment. And then they have to resort to something that you'd rather not resort to, which is, some kind of payday lender or an installment loan from one of the mildly named companies that sound great and aren't. So yeah, if immigration is bigger and bigger all the time, you're going to have many, many more people who are going to have credit trouble.
Yeah, no, I think again, I think on the immigration side is the feedback loop, and I've talked about this probably for the last couple of years. It's just that the amount of non-permanent residents coming here on temporary work visas and that sort of thing. They're most vulnerable to like an economic shock, and so I think that's going to really slow down the rate of immigration into Canada on a temporary basis.
Yeah.
Which again is ultimately demand for housing, and whether that's for purchasing or for rentals.
Yep.
So that's kind of how I view it. I'm going to take two more questions here, and then see who anyone else got any last couple of questions before we shut this down. Let's see what we got here.
I agree. That's a dandy microphone. I'm going to get Doug to get me one of those.
This is a Yeti. I don't know. Apparently they're popular. I don't know.
That's pretty awesome.
Someone's making fun of me here. I don't know, lots of credit provided to Chinese investors. I actually think that this is probably an unpopular answer, but I actually think that once this is kind of the dust settles, I think that the banks are probably going to ramp up the foreign immigration programs, foreign lending programs. I've already heard that some murmurs around that, because like you have to think about it as like obviously like the Canadian government from an economic perspective, they're riding on the housing market.
Yeah.
And so I have to think like they're going to either roll back some of these foreign buyers taxes if prices hypothetically, let's just say they drop 15 or 20%. I have to think they're going to try to re-stimulate, and I think one of those ways is to re-stimulate is to work with the banks on foreign lending programs, and maybe work with local governments to remove some of these policies.
Yeah. Yeah,
unpopular.
I can see a bounce back in consumer indebtedness not too long after this. I think the Canadian consumer is very resilient, as is the Canadian housing market, and so it's all tied together. And I think there's going to be a couple of years or 3 years where there's a big reckoning, and then we'll be back at it again, I think so.
Yeah, I think it's going to, for people that are sitting on cash looking to deploy it, I think you're going to have probably, I don't know, I'm just guessing here, I think you have 24 months probably, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then you're going to want to be piling in.
Yeah.
Because somebody's asking me, can you talk about deleveraging versus inflating out of the debt bubble? So my view on that, Scott, you can go after, but my view on that is, it's going to be a deleveraging initially because you can kind of try to inflate the currency. But at the end of the day, like you have a structural problem with businesses not hiring people back. So that's like an unemployment problem is not something you can solve through, devaluing the currency. You have to get businesses back rehiring.
Yep.
I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a very slow process. A massive amount of Canadian employment is through small business. I forget the number. And I'm not an economist, but I read it this morning somewhere, and it's huge. And if you think that over 50, I think it's 60% or something like that. So if 2/3 of the people are employed with small businesses, and small businesses are going to get hammered in this, then it's going to be a long time before a business owner who had 10 employees and had to let them all go is back to 10. Right? They're going to try and do it with 3, 4, whatever, because, they've been paying the bills for a long time out of their own pockets. Right. And so you're not going to go back to the same level of employment for a long time. And that'll be a big drag, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's kind of the naive thing I keep hearing is, I don't know, I some aspects I almost feel bad for people because I think that people are a little bit, everyone just kind of wants to sit at home and watch sports and not really pay attention to the news or to the economy. But I think there's this reality of people that think that, well, I've just been laid off, but in 2 months' time when we go back, like my job will be there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think unfortunately, I think it's going to be a sad reality for a lot of people that it's just from a business perspective, it just doesn't. It's not that simple.
No, it's going to take a long time for them to ramp back up to any kind of level they were at before, and also, for the people who do get let go, and like I think you said this earlier, get a job in the same industry with someone else, they're going to be paid way less.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because there's going to be all kinds of people lining up for jobs, right? And so I'm not going to pay you what you were making over there. I don't have to, right? And that's not nice, but that's unfortunately the way that stuff's going to work, I think.
Yeah,
so
I think that's.
You got a whole bunch of people who are making less money than before, right? Thousands and thousands of them. And that's bad too. So I think you should try and patent the feedback loop terms or something. You might be on.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think that about that a lot. Like I look at Toronto. I mean, your guys' job sector was absolutely booming, and you have to think about that when you have a tight labor market and businesses are basically clamoring to try to hire people. There's not enough talented workers in sort of the Toronto, Ontario area. Obviously that pushes, wage pressure was way up, but now like when you go back to this thing, it's like the last thing you're going to be doing going into your employer saying, hey, can I get a raise?
I know.
Like you'll be thankful that you have a job. So that just kind of like takes some of the demand out of
expectations just went like this, right?
Yeah.
And so now like there's a new level of playing field and it's way the hell lower than it was, right?
Yeah. So I think that just kind of feeds back into the demand for rent. And like obviously you look at like the pre-sale construction space, there's obviously a lot of pre-sale investors are more like speculative by nature. They're kind of extrapolating recent performance saying, okay, well, if a 1-bedroom is renting for $2,400, by the time this building completes in 2 years, it'll be $2,800 and the price will be way up. But I just think that those expectations, so because I know people are asking here what I think about detached versus condo, I think the value is still in the land. I think condos get hit probably harder.
Yeah, condos in Toronto are going to get nailed. Ultimately, if you got a house in Toronto, you'll be fine at some point. But all those condos downtown, man.
Yeah,
I don't want
to. Yeah, that's my view. I just get into a piece of land if you can. The deflation at first before we transition. But all right, I think that's it. I don't know, Scott, if you have any.
No, that's about it for me. I gotta meet with a guy right after this anyway, so I'll continue about my business.
No, man, I appreciate you taking the time. Where can people find you if they have any questions or need to get a proposal or anything like that?
Well, I'm with Hoyes Michaelis and Associates, so we've got an awesome website. It's full of stuff. It's you go down a rabbit hole there when you're in. I'm at Scott Terrio HMA for Twitter, And my email is sterrio@hoyes.com, hoyes.com. And, if people have questions, I don't mind taking them. That's fine. Usually it's a first step in either doing something or not. Like I said, right now, we're not necessarily telling people to file, right? Because it doesn't make sense. But there's other things you can do to protect yourself financially until things resume normal. And so that's mostly what we're walking people through right now. So.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, man. I appreciate it. Take care, stay safe.
Yep. Have
And
fun.
yeah, we'll chat soon.
Okay. See you guys.
Okay, man. Take care.
Take care.